Some moments change a man's heart forever, and for Ransom, Tank Caldwell, it happened when he saw pure desperation in a child's eyes. The big cowboy thought his days of caring about anyone were long behind him. Tank Caldwell was eating his simple meal outside the Desert Rose Saloon when a small hand grabbed cornbread from his plate. The 58-year-old former gunslinger had seen plenty of trouble in his day, but nothing prepared him for what he found in that dark alley. A frightened little girl, no more than 8 years old, cowered against the wooden fence. Her clothes were torn, her face was dirty, and her thin arms showed fresh bruises. When she looked up at him with those hollow, terrified eyes, Tank felt something crack open inside his chest that he thought was sealed forever. What terrible circumstances had left this child alone and starving on the streets? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Dry Creek sat like a weathered bone in the New Mexico territory, bleached white by relentless sun and scoured clean by desert winds that never seemed to rest. It was the kind of place where honest folk came to disappear from their past, and dishonest folk came to hide from their future. The main street stretched barely 300 yards from the old Mission Bell Tower to the cemetery gates, as if reminding every soul that walked its dusty length about the brevity of earthly concerns. Tank Caldwell had called this forgotten corner of creation home for nearly 15 years now, ever since he'd hung up his guns and picked up carpenter's tools. His cabin sat on the eastern edge of town, close enough to hear the church bells on Sunday morning, but far enough from the saloon to avoid the Saturday night troubles that seemed to follow drinking men like shadows follow light. The structure itself reflected its owner's nature, solid, practical, built to last but with no unnecessary ornamentation. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, offering shade in the brutal afternoon heat and a place to sit when the evening brought its brief respite. Inside, the cabin told the story of a man who had learned to live with less. A single room served as kitchen, parlor, and dining area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a simple wooden table positioned to catch the morning light. Tank's bed occupied a small alcove, separated from the main room by a curtain sewn from feed sacks. The only luxury was a shelf of books, mostly the Bible, a few volumes of poetry, and some practical manuals on carpentry and farming. Hidden beneath loose floorboards lay his past, a well-oiled Colt revolver, gun belt, and a small leather pouch containing newspaper clippings that bore witness to deeds he could never quite forget. The transformation from feared gunslinger to quiet carpenter hadn't happened overnight. Ransom Caldwell, few remembered his given name now, had earned his reputation across 3 territories as a man who never missed his target and never backed down from a fight. They called him Tank for his imposing frame and seemingly impenetrable resolve in the face of danger. At 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing close to 240 pounds, he cut an intimidating figure even in work clothes. His hands, now calloused from honest labor, still moved with the fluid precision that had once made him legendary with a sidearm. But legends, Tank had learned, were heavy burdens for mortal men to carry. The weight of 12 confirmed kills, all legal, all in defense of others, but kills nonetheless, had eventually bent his shoulders and grayed his temples long before his 58th year should have warranted. He'd watched too many young men die, seen too many widows weep, stood over too many graves of friends who'd chosen the wrong side of justice. The day he'd buried his last partner, shot down in a dusty street in Amarillo over a card game gone wrong, Tank had made a promise to himself and to God that his guns would never again take a life. The people of Dry Creek had accepted him with the cautious respect afforded to dangerous men who chose peace. Sheriff Morton, a graying veteran of the Apache Wars, had been the first to extend genuine friendship. Patricia Hawkins, who ran the Desert Rose Saloon with an iron fist and a generous heart, had offered him credit when he'd first arrived with empty pockets and a determination to start fresh. Doc Henderson, the town's physician and sometime preacher, had provided spiritual counsel during Tank's darkest moments of doubt about his chosen path. Most townspeople kept a respectful distance, greeting him with polite nods, but never lingering for extended conversation. They appreciated the work he did, repairing sagging porches, fixing broken wagon wheels, building new additions for growing families, but they also remembered the stories. Even in a place where most folks had something to hide or forget, Tank's reputation preceded him like morning shadows. Long and dark and impossible to escape entirely, his daily routine had become as predictable as the desert sunrise. Up before dawn to tend his small vegetable garden and check on the 3 horses he kept in a modest corral behind the cabin. Breakfast of coffee, cornbread, and whatever eggs his hens had provided. Then into town for whatever carpentry work awaited. And there was always work in a place where the harsh climate and harder living took a constant toll on buildings and equipment. Lunch he typically took at the Desert Rose, not for the company, but because Patricia served the best stew for 50 miles in any direction. She had a gift for making tough beef tender and bland vegetables flavorful, skills probably learned during her own mysterious past before arriving in Dry Creek. Tank always sat at the same corner table, back to the wall facing the door. Old habits that even 15 years of peace couldn't completely erase. Afternoons meant more work, usually outdoors, where the sun could bake the lingering guilt from his bones, and the honest sweat could wash away the phantom smell of gun smoke that sometimes clung to his dreams. He'd developed a reputation for fair dealing and quality craftsmanship, charging reasonable prices and never asking for payment until the work was completed to the customer's satisfaction. Evenings found him back at his cabin, reading by lamplight or simply sitting on his porch, listening to the desert's vast silence and pondering the strange turns his life had taken. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, even grateful for it. Alone, he didn't have to explain his past or justify his choices. Alone, he could almost forget the man he used to be. The irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to escape violence, he'd found a different kind of isolation. The very reputation that made others wary also protected him from the kinds of entanglements that might have led him back to his guns. Young hotshots looking to make a name occasionally drifted through Dry Creek, but one look at Tank's scarred hands and steady gaze usually convinced them to try their luck elsewhere. He'd made peace with this arrangement, or thought he had. His carpentry brought satisfaction. Creating something lasting and useful felt like a small penance for all the destruction he'd once wrought. The quiet rhythms of his days provided a healing balm for wounds that had never quite stopped bleeding. He slept better now than he had in years, though the dreams still came sometimes, filled with the faces of men he'd killed and friends he'd failed to save. Tank had convinced himself that this was enough. This simple, solitary existence built on honest work and careful distance from others. He'd learned to find contentment in small things, the perfect fit of a mortise and tenon joint, the satisfaction of a roof that wouldn't leak come the next storm, the grateful nod of a customer whose broken fence would stand strong for another decade. What he hadn't expected was how quickly that carefully constructed piece could shatter with something as simple as a small hand reaching for cornbread and a pair of desperate eyes looking up at him from a dark alley. In that moment, all his hard-won tranquility crumbled like a house built on sand, and Tank Caldwell found himself facing the one thing his guns and his fists and his reputation couldn't fix: a child who needed saving, and the possibility that saving her might cost him everything he'd built to keep his demons at bay. Tank set his tin plate on the wooden crate that served as his evening table and leaned back against the saloon's weathered wall. The stolen cornbread had left a gap in his simple meal, but his appetite had vanished the moment he'd seen that small, desperate hand dart across his vision. He pushed himself to his feet, joints protesting after a long day of replacing roof shingles on the Henderson place, and walked slowly toward the narrow alley where the thief had disappeared. The space between the saloon and Garrett's general store was barely wide enough for a grown man to pass through comfortably. cast in deep shadow even during the brightest part of the day. Now, with evening settling over Dry Creek like a threadbare blanket, the alley was nearly black. Tank paused at the entrance, letting his eyes adjust while his ears strained for any sound that might betray the presence of whoever had taken his food. A soft whimper, quickly stifled, came from somewhere near the back of the narrow passage. "I know you're in there," Tank called softly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, but lacking the harsh edge it once held. "I'm not fixing to hurt you. Just want to talk." Silence stretched between them like a held breath. Tank took a careful step forward, then another, until he could make out a huddled shape pressed against the back wall of the alley. What he saw made his chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt in years, protective rage mixed with heartbreaking pity. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, though malnutrition made it difficult to judge with certainty. She wore a dress that had once been blue, but was now the color of dust and despair, torn in several places and far too large for her thin frame. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles around a face that would have been pretty, if not for the hollow cheeks and the bruises that mottled her pale skin like storm clouds. But it was her eyes that stopped Tank cold, wide, dark, filled with a terror so profound it seemed to echo in the depths of his own soul. In those eyes, he saw himself at 7 years old, cowering in a similar alley, while his drunken father searched for him with a leather strap and murderous intentions. He saw the frightened boy who had learned too early that the world was a harsh place where the strong preyed upon the weak, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. "Easy now," Tank murmured, crouching down to make himself less intimidating. Even in that position, he towered over the child, but he kept his hands visible and his movements slow. "What's your name, little one?" The girl's eyes darted left and right, seeking escape routes that didn't exist. Her small chest rose and fell rapidly, like a trapped rabbit's. For a long moment, Tank thought she wouldn't answer at all. Then in a voice barely louder than the desert wind, she whispered, "Pip, Pip." Tank repeated gently, "That's a fine name." "I'm Tank. I live just outside town." He nodded toward his stolen cornbread, which the girl clutched against her chest like a precious treasure. "You must be powerful hungry to risk stealing from a man my size." A tear traced a clean line down Pip's dirty cheek. "I'm sorry, mister. I didn't mean no harm. Her voice broke, and she seemed to shrink even smaller against the wall. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Tank asked, Pip's brow furrowed, as if the question required serious consideration. "Don't rightly know. Maybe 3 days, 4. She looked down at the cornbread. "This is the most food I seen in a week." Tank felt something cold and sharp twist in his stomach. "Where's your family, Pip? Your ma and pa?" The question brought fresh tears. "Pa died in the mine collapse 2 years back. Ma and me, we stayed on at the copper camp, 'cause Ma said the company would take care of us. She worked in the company store, keeping books and such." Pip wiped her nose with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her face. "But then the mine closed sudden-like. Said the vein played out and all the workers had to go. What about your ma?" "She was supposed to meet me at the old mission 3 weeks ago." Pip's voice grew smaller with each word. "Said she had some business to finish up at the camp, something about the books not adding up right. Told me to wait for her there, no matter what." Tank's blood began to simmer. He'd heard stories about mining companies and their treatment of workers. Promises broken, wages stolen, families abandoned when the profits dried up. "You been waiting at the mission all this time?" Pip nodded. "Father Miguel, he tried to help at first. Gave me food and a place to sleep in the bell tower. But then some men came looking for me, asking questions. Father Miguel got scared and told me I had to go. Said it wasn't safe." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I think something bad happened to Ma." The cold feeling in Tank's stomach spread outward, reaching tendrils of ice through his chest and down his arms. He'd felt this sensation before, always just before violence erupted around him like a summer thunderstorm. But this time, the anger wasn't directed at some fool with more pride than sense challenging him to a duel. This fury was aimed at faceless men who would abandon a child to starve in the desert while her mother disappeared under mysterious circumstances. These men who came looking for you, Tank said carefully. What did they look like? Big men. Well-dressed, not like miners. They had guns, but fancy ones. Silver and such. Pip's voice trembled. They asked Father Miguel if any women or children from the copper camp had come through. When he said no, they said if any did show up, he was to send word to Mr. Vale at the mining office in Santa Rosa. Tank knew the name. Marcus Vale owned 3 mining operations in the territory and had a reputation for caring more about profits than people. If Vale's men were hunting for Pip, it meant her mother had stumbled onto something worth killing for. Pip, Tank said gently, how long you been on your own since leaving the mission? Maybe 2 weeks? I've been sleeping in different places trying to stay hid, eating whatever I can find. She looked down at the cornbread again. I'm real sorry I took your food, mister. I know stealing's wrong, but I was so hungry I couldn't think straight. Tank studied the child's face, noting the way her cheekbones stood out too sharply and how her dress hung loose around her narrow shoulders. 2 weeks of near starvation for a child who'd already endured too much hardship. The protective instinct that had lain dormant in him for 15 years roared to life with an intensity that shocked him. He thought about walking away. God knew he had his own problems, his own past to atone for. Taking in a stray child would complicate his carefully ordered life and potentially draw the kind of attention he'd spent years avoiding. The smart thing would be to give her some money, point her toward the next town, and let someone else deal with her troubles. But as Tank looked into Pip's desperate eyes, he saw not just a hungry child, but a reflection of every innocent victim he'd failed to protect during his violent years. He saw a chance for redemption that had nothing to do with building fences or repairing roofs, and everything to do with the man he wanted to be versus the man he'd been. Come on, Tank said, standing slowly and extending his hand. Let's get you fed proper. Then we'll figure out what to do about your ma. Pip stared at his outstretched hand as if it might transform into a snake. You ain't gonna turn me over to them men? Not likely, Tank replied, and for the first time in 15 years, his voice carried the cold promise of violence that had once made grown men step aside. But first things first. You need food, a bath, and a safe place to sleep. Everything else can wait till morning. After a long moment, Pip reached out and placed her tiny, dirt-stained hand in his massive palm. Tank felt the weight of that small trust settle on his shoulders like a yoke, binding him to a path he couldn't see clearly, but knew he had to walk. As they emerged from the alley together, he caught Patricia watching from the saloon doorway. Her expression unreadable in the lamplight. The look in her eyes told him that news of Tank Caldwell taking in a vagrant child would be all over Dry Creek by sunrise. His quiet life was officially over. Somehow he found he didn't mind as much as he'd expected. The walk to Tank's cabin felt longer than usual, partly because he had to shorten his stride to match Pip's exhausted shuffle, and partly because he couldn't shake the feeling that curious eyes followed them from every window and doorway they passed. Dry Creek wasn't large enough for secrets to survive more than a day, and Tank Caldwell walking through town with a child was news that would spread faster than wildfire in drought season. Pip stumbled twice during the short journey, her legs unsteady from hunger and exhaustion. The second time, Tank simply scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how little she weighed. She tensed initially, then relaxed against his chest with a sigh that spoke of bone-deep weariness. By the time they reached his porch, she was fast asleep. Tank settled her gently in his own chair by the fireplace while he lit lamps and stoked the coals back to life. In the yellow light, Pip's condition looked even worse than it had in the alley. The bruises on her arms weren't fresh. They'd faded to the yellow-green of old injuries, but there were too many of them for a clumsy child. Someone had hurt this little girl, and Tank felt his jaw clench as he considered the implications. He put water on to boil and rummaged through his meager food supplies. Cornbread, beans, some salt pork, dried apples, and half a jar of honey Patricia had given him in trade for fixing her broken window. Not much variety, but enough to put some meat back on Pip's thin bones, if she stayed long enough. The thought brought him up short. How long was he planning to keep her? Until her mother turned up, until he could find a family willing to take her in, until those well-dressed men with fancy guns stopped looking for her. Tank realized he hadn't thought beyond getting her fed and safe for the night. But already the complications were piling up like storm clouds on the horizon. Pip woke when the smell of cooking beans filled the cabin. She sat up slowly, blinking in confusion until her gaze found Tank stirring the pot over the fire. "Wasn't dreaming then," she said softly. "No, little one. You're safe here." Tank ladled beans and salt pork into a bowl, added a thick slice of cornbread with honey, and set it on the table. "Take your time eating. Your stomach needs to remember how to handle proper food." Pip approached the table like a wild animal approaching bait, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. She took a small bite, then another, and finally began eating with the desperate intensity of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to not be hungry. Tank watched her carefully, ready to intervene if she made herself sick. "Pip," he said gently, "your ma ever mention what kind of business she was handling at the mining camp? What she meant about the books not adding up?" The girl paused mid-bite, a shadow crossing her face. "Ma was real good with numbers. Better than most of the men," she used to say. She'd been keeping track of how much the company owed the workers, 'cause some of them couldn't read or write proper. Pip took a sip of water. Last few weeks before the mine closed, she kept staying up late, going over the books again and again. Said something wasn't right, but she wouldn't tell me what. Tank filed that information away. A bookkeeper who discovered discrepancies in a mining company's records, then disappeared just before armed men came looking for her daughter. The picture wasn't pretty, but it was getting clearer. What about this? Tank pulled a small object from Pip's dress pocket, a tarnished silver locket he'd noticed when carrying her. "This belonged to your ma?" Pip's eyes filled with tears as she reached for the locket with trembling fingers. "She gave it to me the night before she was supposed to meet me. Said no matter what happened, I should keep it safe." She opened the tiny clasp to reveal a faded photograph of a young woman with Pip's dark eyes and determined chin. "That's her when she was about my age. Ma said her own ma gave it to her, and someday I'd give it to my daughter." Tank studied the photograph, memorizing the face. If Pip's mother was still alive, he'd need to recognize her. If she wasn't, well, he'd cross that bridge when he came to it. "Pip, I need to ask you something important. Those men who came looking for you at the mission, did Father Miguel tell you anything else about them? What they said, how they acted?" "They weren't from around here," Pip said, clutching the locket close to her chest. "Talked different, like city folk. And they weren't asking nice questions, if you know what I mean. Father Miguel was real scared after they left. Kept looking over his shoulder and jumping at every sound." Tank frowned. Mining company officials sending city men with guns to hunt down a child suggested something far worse than simple accounting errors. This had the smell of a cover-up, the kind that left witnesses buried in unmarked graves. "Listen to me careful, Pip. You can't go back into town alone, not until we figure out what happened to your ma. Those men might still be around, and they might not be as kind as Father Miguel if they find you. Are you gonna help me find her?" The hope in Pip's voice was heartbreaking. Tank hesitated. Getting involved meant abandoning the peaceful life he'd built, possibly putting himself back on a path that led to violence and bloodshed. But looking at this brave little girl who'd survived weeks on her own while holding on to hope that her mother would return, he found he couldn't do anything else. "I'll help you," he said quietly. "But it might be dangerous. There might be men who don't want your ma found, and they might not hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way." "I ain't scared," Pip declared, though her trembling hands suggested otherwise. "Ma always said Caldwells don't back down from what's right." Tank blinked. "Caldwell?" "Penelope Caldwell. Pip's just what Ma called me." She tilted her head. "That's funny. Your name's Tank Caldwell, too. You reckon we might be kin?" The irony wasn't lost on Tank. In trying to escape his past, he'd stumbled into a child who shared his name and possibly his stubborn streak. "Could be," he said. Caldwell's not uncommon in these parts, but privately he wondered if fate had brought Pip to him for reasons beyond coincidence. Maybe some debts could only be paid by protecting the innocent, regardless of the cost. "Tell you what," Tank said, making a decision that would change both their lives. "Tomorrow I'll ride out to the mining camp, see what I can learn about your ma. Tonight you get some real sleep in a real bed." He gestured toward his own sleeping alcove. "I'll take the floor by the fire." "I couldn't take your bed, Mr. Tank. You're not taking it." "I'm giving it." Tank's tone brooked no argument. "And it's just Tank. We're family now, remember?" As Pip settled into his bed, clutching her mother's locket and the small rag doll she'd pulled from her dress, Tank realized he'd just committed himself to a course of action that could destroy everything he'd built in Dry Creek. But watching the child finally relax into genuine sleep, he found he didn't regret the choice. Some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant becoming the man he'd sworn never to be again. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the harsh reality of Tank's new circumstances. He'd slept poorly on the hard floor, waking every hour to check on Pip, who'd thrashed through nightmares that left her whimpering in her sleep. Twice he'd had to gently shake her awake when the dreams became too violent, watching helplessly as terror clouded her eyes before recognition returned. Over breakfast, more beans and cornbread. Though Pip ate with better appetite than the night before, Tank outlined his plan to visit the abandoned copper mine. Pip insisted on coming along, arguing with a determination that reminded him uncomfortably of his own stubborn nature. "It's my ma we're looking for," she said, crossing her thin arms. "I got a right to help find her." "You got a right to stay safe," Tank countered. "If those men are still around, then you'll need someone who knows the camp layout." "I lived there 2 years, Tank. I know every building, every hiding spot, every way in and out." Pip's jaw set in a line that brooked no argument. "Besides, you can't leave me here alone. What if they come looking?" Tank had to admit she had a point. Taking her along was risky, but leaving her unprotected might be worse. "Stay close to me, do exactly what I say, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments. Deal." Pip stuck out her small hand, and Tank shook it solemnly. The ride to the copper mine took most of the morning. Tank had saddled his most gentle horse, a steady mare named Rosie, and settled Pip in front of him. The girl proved to be a natural rider, relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's gait and pointing out landmarks as they traveled through the scrub-covered hills. "There," she said as they crested a ridge. "Copper Creek Camp." Tank reined in Rosie and studied the settlement below. What had once been a bustling mining operation now looked like a ghost town. Wooden buildings stood empty, their doors hanging open like gaping mouths. Abandoned equipment rusted in the desert sun, and tumbleweeds had already begun to collect against the structures. But it was the hasty nature of the abandonment that caught Tank's attention. Clothes still hung on lines. Tools lay scattered where they'd been dropped, and a child's wooden toy sat forgotten in the dust. "Looks like folks left in a hurry," Tank observed. They did. Ma said the foreman came around one morning, told everyone they had 3 days to clear out. Company was done with the mine, wouldn't pay for transportation or help with moving. "Just go!" They rode down into the camp, and Tank's unease grew with every empty building they passed. He'd seen mining camps shut down before, but this felt different. Wrong. The silence was too complete, too final. Pip directed him to a small cabin at the camp's edge. "That's where we lived," she said softly. Tank hitched Rosie to a post and followed Pip inside. The cabin was modest, but had been kept clean and organized until someone had torn it apart looking for something. Drawers hung open, their contents scattered across the floor. Books lay spine-broken where they'd been thrown. Even the mattress had been slashed open, its stuffing spilling out like cotton snow. "They came here," Pip whispered, her face pale, "after Ma disappeared. They searched our place." Tank knelt and examined the chaos more carefully. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a methodical search conducted by people who knew what they were looking for. He found scraps of paper torn into pieces too small to read, the remains of what might have been accounting ledgers. "Your ma keep her work papers here." "Some of them. But she was real careful about the important stuff. Said the company men didn't like workers asking too many questions about money. Pip moved to a loose floorboard near the window. Ma had a hiding spot, though. Maybe she pried up the board and reached into the space beneath, then froze. It's gone. What's gone? Ma's special ledger. The one she kept her real notes in, not the company books. Pip's voice cracked. She hid it here in case something happened. Said if anyone ever came asking questions, I should show them this. Tank felt cold certainty settle in his chest. Pip's mother had discovered something worth killing for, and now she was missing along with the evidence. The men who'd searched this cabin hadn't found what they were looking for, which meant they'd have to silence the one person who knew the truth. They spent another hour searching the camp, finding more signs of hasty departure, but no clues about where the workers had gone or what had happened to Pip's mother. Tank noted horse tracks near the company office. Expensive horses with well-maintained shoes, not the kind miners could afford. As they prepared to leave, Pip suddenly grabbed Tank's arm. Wait, there's someone I should talk to, Mrs. Patterson. She lived 3 cabins down and was Ma's closest friend. If anyone knows what Ma was worried about, it'd be her. They found Lila Patterson's cabin in the same state as the others, abandoned and searched. But Pip insisted they check the root cellar behind the house, a hiding place she and Mrs. Patterson's daughter had used during games of hide-and-seek. The cellar door was concealed beneath a layer of tumbleweeds and sand, and Tank had to clear it carefully to avoid making noise that might carry. Inside the cool, dark space, they found more than vegetables and preserves. They found Mrs. Patterson herself. The middle-aged woman was gaunt and frightened, but alive. She nearly screamed when Tank's large frame filled the cellar entrance, then broke down sobbing when she recognized Pip. "Oh, honey, I thought you were dead," she whispered, pulling the girl into a fierce embrace. "I thought they got you too. Mrs. Patterson, what happened to Ma?" Pip's voice was small and scared. The woman's face hardened. "Same thing that happened to my Henry and the Morrison boys, and anyone else who asked too many questions about missing wages. They took them, Pip, loaded them in wagons and hauled them away like sacks of grain." Tank felt his blood turn to ice. Took them where? North, towards Santa Rosa, but not to the town, to that place in the hills where they're building the new railroad spur. Heard tell they need workers, but can't find enough men willing to work for the wages they're offering. Mrs. Patterson's eyes were hollow with despair. So they take 'em instead, work 'em like slaves until they drop or try to run. The picture was becoming clear now, and it was uglier than Tank had imagined. Not just murder to cover up embezzlement, but human trafficking disguised as business operations. How many people they take? Tank asked quietly. Maybe 30 from this camp alone. All the ones who'd been asking questions about back pay or talking union. Mrs. Patterson looked at Pip with haunted eyes. "Your ma, she was trying to get proof of what they were doing. Said she had enough evidence to bring down the whole operation if she could just get it to the territorial." Marshal. Tank studied the fear in the woman's face and made another decision that would change everything. "Mrs. Patterson, pack what you can carry. You're coming back to Dry Creek with us. I can't. You can and you will. They find you here, you'll end up in the same place as the others." Tank's voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced death before and wasn't impressed by it. "You got family elsewhere?" "Sister in Colorado." "Good. Soon as it's safe, we'll get you on a stage to Colorado. But right now, you're under my protection." As they helped Mrs. Patterson gather her few remaining possessions, Tank realized his quiet life in Dry Creek was officially over. He was committed now to a path that could only end in violence or justice, and in his experience, those two things were often the same. The return journey to Dry Creek took on the weight of a funeral procession. Mrs. Patterson rode behind Tank on his second horse, her face etched with the kind of grief that came from watching an entire way of life disappear overnight. Pip sat quietly in front of Tank, clutching her mother's locket and asking questions he couldn't answer. "If Ma's alive, why hasn't she come back for me?" The girl's voice was barely audible over the desert wind. Tank chose his words carefully. "Could be she can't get away. Could be she's trying to protect you by staying gone. Your ma sounds like a smart woman who loves you fierce. She wouldn't abandon you without good reason. But what if? No what ifs, Tank said firmly. We deal with what we know, not what we fear. Right now we know she's missing, and we know who took her. That's enough to start with. Back in Dry Creek, Tank settled Mrs. Patterson in the small room above Patricia's saloon. The arrangement raised eyebrows, but Patricia asked no questions when Tank explained that the woman needed temporary shelter and protection. Word would spread, as it always did in small towns, but Tank was past caring about gossip. That evening, while Pip slept on a makeshift bed near his fireplace, Tank sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and contemplated the magnitude of what he'd learned. A mining operation using kidnapped workers as slave labor, with Marcus Vale's name attached to the whole ugly business. The kind of systematic cruelty that demanded justice, even if seeking that justice meant abandoning everything he'd built. Sheriff Morton's boots on the porch steps interrupted his brooding. The older man climbed the stairs slowly, favoring his left leg where a patchy iron had found its mark years before. "Evening, Tank? Mind if I sit?" Tank gestured to the second chair he'd built but rarely used. Morton settled his lean frame and studied Tank's face in the lamplight spilling from the cabin windows. "Heard you brought some folks back from the copper camp today. Heard some other things, too. Stories about missing workers and company men with guns." Morton's voice was conversational, but Tank could hear the steel underneath. "Want to tell me what you've stumbled into?" Tank respected Morton too much to lie, so he laid out everything they'd learned: Pip's story, her mother's disappearance, the evidence of forced labor at the railroad construction site. Morton listened without interruption, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail. "Marcus Vale," Morton said when Tank finished. "I've had my eye on that snake for years, but he's careful. Always just this side of legal, always has alibis and paperwork to cover his tracks." The sheriff spat into the dust. "You realize what you're talking about here? Taking on Vale means taking on his whole organization. Politicians, judges, territorial officials. He owns more people than you might think." Then we go around them. To who? Federal marshals are spread thin, and half of them are on Vale's payroll anyway. Morton leaned forward. "Tank, I appreciate what you're trying to do for that little girl, but this is bigger than one missing woman. This is a machine that's been grinding up people for years." Tank was quiet for a long moment, watching heat lightning flicker on the horizon. "My whole life I've been running from fights or starting them for the wrong reasons. Maybe it's time I stood and fought for the right ones. Fighting Vale means becoming the man you used to be. You ready for that?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Tank thought about Pip sleeping inside, about Mrs. Patterson's hollow eyes, about 30 missing workers whose families might never know what happened to them. "I've been that man before," Tank said finally. "Maybe I can be him again, just long enough to set some things right." Morton stood slowly, joints protesting. "If you're determined to do this, you'll need help. Vale's got at least 20 men working for him, maybe more. Professional guns, not cowboys playing tough. You offering?" "I'm offering to look the other way when you need me to." "Beyond that," Morton shrugged, "I've got a town to protect and a badge that limits what I can do. But if evidence of federal crimes happen to find its way to the right people, well, that's just good citizenship." After Morton left, Tank sat alone with his thoughts until the coffee grew cold in his cup. Through the cabin window, he could see Pip stirring restlessly in her sleep, tiny hands clutching at blankets like they might anchor her to safety. The sight strengthened his resolve. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Tank was teaching Pip basic knots and rope work on the front porch when a rider approached from town. The man was well-dressed in a city suit, despite the desert heat, riding a horse that cost more than most people in Dry Creek made in a year. "You'd be Caldwell," the stranger said without dismounting. His voice carried the flat vowels of back east money. "I'd be Tank. You'd be lost," the man smiled without humor. "Name's Morrison. I represent certain business interests in the territory. Heard you been asking questions about the copper mine situation." Tank stood slowly, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "Must be slow news days. If my business is worth a special trip from town, your business becomes my business when it interferes with legitimate operations." The mining company fulfilled all legal obligations when they closed Copper Creek. The workers were given proper notice and fair compensation. Funny thing about that, Tank said conversationally. Talked to some of those workers recently. They remember things different. Morrison's smile faded. Mr. Caldwell, you seem like a reasonable man trying to do right by an unfortunate child. My employers appreciate that sentiment. They're prepared to be generous. Say $500 to help with the girl's care and placement in a suitable home elsewhere, and in return, you stop asking questions about things that don't concern you. The girl gets a fresh start somewhere safe. Everyone wins. Tank was quiet for so long that Morrison began to look uncomfortable. When Tank finally spoke, his voice carried the cold promise that had once made grown men step aside. Tell your employers that Tank Caldwell doesn't take their money and he doesn't take their threats. Tell them if they want to discuss the missing workers, they can come talk to me themselves. Tell them, Tank paused, letting the silence stretch. Tell them I'm done being reasonable. Morrison wheeled his horse around and rode back toward town at a pace that suggested urgency. Tank watched him go, then found Pip staring at him with wide eyes. Was that one of them? She asked quietly. One of them, Tank confirmed. He knelt to her level. Pip, things are about to get dangerous. Real dangerous. You understand what that means? The girl nodded solemnly. Means we're getting close to finding Ma. Tank felt a grim smile tug at his lips. Yeah, that's exactly what it means. As he watched dust settle in Morrison's wake, Tank realized he'd just declared war on one of the most powerful men in the territory. There was no backing down now, no return to his quiet life of honest carpentry and peaceful solitude. The old Tank Caldwell was waking up, and God help anyone who stood between him and that little girl's mother. 2 days after Morrison's visit, Tank found himself standing in Doc Henderson's office, staring down at a piece of paper that changed everything. The document bore official territorial seals and signatures, but Tank's hands shook slightly as he read the damning words. Death certificate, Doc Henderson said quietly. For one, Sarah Caldwell, age 32, died of fever complications at Copper Creek Camp 3 weeks ago. Body disposed of according to territorial health regulations due to contagious disease concerns. Pip sat in a chair beside Tank's elbow, her small face pale but determined. That's not right, she said firmly. Ma wasn't sick. She was healthy as a horse right up until the day I last saw her. Tank studied the certificate more carefully. The signatures looked authentic, but something felt wrong about the whole document. The paper was too clean, the ink too fresh for something allegedly filed weeks ago. Where'd this come from, Doc? Territorial office in Santa Rosa. Sheriff Morton requested records on missing persons from the Copper Camp. This came back with the official response. Henderson's weathered face showed his skepticism. Convenient timing, don't you think? Tank folded the certificate and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Real convenient. Just happens to show up right after Vale's man pays me a visit. Tank, Henderson said carefully. If they're willing to forge death certificates, they're not planning to let this matter rest. A man doesn't go to that kind of trouble unless he's got something big to hide. That evening, Tank sat with Pip on his porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of blood and gold. The girl had been quiet since seeing the death certificate, clutching her mother's locket and staring into the distance with eyes too old for her young face. It's not true, she said suddenly. The paper's lying. Ma's not dead. Tank looked at her carefully. What makes you so sure? Because I'd know. Pip's voice carried a conviction that reminded Tank of her mother's alleged determination to expose the truth. Ma and me, we always had a connection. When Pa died in the mine, I felt it happen, even though I was miles away at the store. Like something tore inside me. She touched the locket. I don't feel that now. She's alive somewhere, and she's waiting for me to find her. Tank wanted to believe the girl's intuition, but he'd seen too much of the world's cruelty to trust in mystical connections between loved ones. Still, the forged certificate suggested Vale's people were desperate to end the search, and desperate men made mistakes. Pip, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen careful. Tank chose his words slowly. I'm going to find your ma one way or another, but it might mean doing things, violent things, that I swore I'd never do again. You understand what I'm saying? The girl nodded solemnly. You're going to have to be the old Tank again. The one with the guns. Maybe, probably. Tank studied her face. That doesn't scare you? Should it? Tank considered the question. The old Tank Caldwell had been a killer, but he'd never killed anyone who didn't have it coming. He'd protected innocence, stood up for the weak, and faced down bullies with iron and lead when words weren't enough. Maybe that man wasn't entirely someone to be ashamed of. No, he said finally. I reckon it shouldn't. The next morning brought another visitor. But this one, Tank welcomed. Mrs. Patterson knocked softly on his door just after sunrise. Carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Found something you need to see, she said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a blood-stained bandana and a small notebook. Hid these in the well behind my cabin before I went underground. Figured if something happened to me, maybe someone would find them eventually. Tank examined the bandana first. The blood was dry and brown, but still clearly visible against the blue fabric. Whose? Henry's, my husband. Mrs. Patterson's voice was steady, but Tank could see the pain in her eyes. He was trying to organize the workers, talking about going to the territorial authorities about the missing wages. Vale's men came for him 3 days before they closed the mine. They kill him? Tried to. Henry fought back, got cut up pretty bad before they loaded him in the wagon with the others. Tore this off his neck when they dragged him away. She touched the bandana gently. But the important thing is what's in the notebook. Tank opened the small book and found himself looking at meticulously kept records in a woman's careful handwriting. Dates, names, amounts owed to workers, and a running tally of wages that had been reported as paid, but never actually distributed. This is Sarah's work, Mrs. Patterson continued. She'd been keeping track of every discrepancy, every lie the company told about payments. Started when she noticed her own pay didn't match what the company books showed. Tank flipped through page after page of damning evidence. According to Sarah's records, Vale's mining operation had stolen nearly $15,000 in worker wages over 2 years, enough money to justify murder and kidnapping to keep the theft hidden. Mrs. Patterson, Tank said slowly, this is the evidence Sarah was trying to get to the territorial marshal. This could bring down Vale's entire operation if the right people see it. Problem is, how do you get it to someone who isn't on Vale's payroll? Tank thought about Sheriff Morton's warning, that Vale owned politicians, judges, and territorial officials. But there had to be someone beyond the reach of mining company bribes, someone with the authority to act on federal crimes. I'll find a way, Tank promised. But first, I need to know exactly where they're holding the workers. This proves the theft, but we need to free the people and get testimony from witnesses. Mrs. Patterson nodded toward the notebook. Sarah figured that out too. Last entry she made, night before she disappeared. She'd learned they were building that railroad spur with slave labor, using the kidnapped miners. Even wrote down the location. Tank found the final entry, written in Sarah's increasingly urgent handwriting. Construction camp, 15 miles north of Santa Rosa, Hidden Valley past Deadman's Ridge. At least 50 workers heavily guarded. Must get help soon. Conditions worse than prison. They're working people to death. As Tank read those words, he felt the familiar cold certainty settle in his chest. The same feeling he'd experienced before every justified killing, every righteous battle he'd fought in his younger days. Vale's people had made this personal when they took Sarah, but now it was more than personal. It was about justice for everyone who'd suffered under their systematic cruelty. Pip, he said quietly, how do you feel about taking a trip to Santa Rosa? The girl's eyes blazed with determination. When do we leave? Tank looked at the evidence in his hands, then at the brave child who'd already endured more hardship than most adults. He thought about the path ahead, dangerous, probably violent, certainly life-changing. Tomorrow, he said. We leave tomorrow, As Mrs. Patterson departed with Tank's promise to send word when it was safe, Tank began the grim process of preparing for war. His peaceful days in Dry Creek were numbered, but if that was the price of bringing Sarah Caldwell home to her daughter, he'd pay it gladly. Some debts could only be settled with blood. Tank spent the night preparing for what might be his final journey, cleaning his long, unused Colt and checking his ammunition supply. Pip slept restlessly on her makeshift bed, occasionally calling out for her mother in dreams that broke Tank's heart. As dawn approached, he found himself staring at a hand-drawn map tucked between the pages of Sarah's notebook, a map he'd initially dismissed as unimportant. Now, studying it more carefully by lamplight, Tank realized the map showed far more than just the railroad construction site. It detailed an intricate network of trails, caves, and hidden camps stretching across 3 counties. Numbers beside various locations suggested dates and head counts, while arrows indicated movement patterns between sites. "What in hell?" Tank muttered, spreading the map on his table and weighing down the corners with coffee cups. A soft knock interrupted his study. Sheriff Morton stood on the porch, fully dressed despite the early hour, his face grim in the pre-dawn light. "Need to talk." "Tank, something's happened." Tank invited him inside, where Morton's eyes immediately fixed on the weapons and supplies laid out for travel. "Going somewhere?" "Santa Rosa. Going to get those people out of Vale's work camp." Tank gestured toward the map. "Found something interesting, though." "Look at this." Morton studied the hand-drawn document, his expression growing increasingly puzzled. "Tank, this isn't a map of one labor camp. This shows at least a dozen sites, maybe more. And these numbers, if they represent people, we're talking about hundreds of missing workers, not just the 30 from Copper Creek." Tank felt a cold realization creeping up his spine. Mrs. Patterson said Sarah was trying to get evidence to the territorial marshal. But what if she was trying to expose something bigger than wage theft? Much bigger. Morton pointed to markings along what appeared to be established routes. These looked like supply lines, movement schedules. "Tank, I think your Sarah stumbled onto a massive human trafficking operation." Before Tank could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew both men to the window. 3 riders were coming up the trail toward his cabin, and even in the dim light, Tank could see they weren't paying a social call. "Back door," Morton whispered, drawing his sidearm. "Get the girl and go." But Tank was already strapping on his gun belt, the familiar weight of the Colt settling against his hip like an old friend. "Pip," he called softly. "Time to go." The girl was awake instantly, gathering her few possessions with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to pack quickly. As she tucked her mother's locket inside her dress, Tank noticed she was also clutching something else, a folded piece of paper he'd never seen before. "What's that?" "Letter from Ma. Found it sewn into my doll's dress last night when I couldn't sleep." Pip's voice was urgent but controlled. "Tank, Ma's not at the railroad camp. She's somewhere else. Somewhere those men didn't find her." Tank took the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. Sarah's familiar handwriting covered both sides of the small paper in urgent, cramped lines. "My dearest Pip, if you're reading this, it means the worst has happened, and I couldn't come for you as planned. The men I've been investigating discovered what I was doing. They came for me 3 nights ago, but I escaped through the mine tunnels I used to explore with your father. I'm hiding now in the old Apache caves north of Deadman's Ridge, but I can't stay much longer. The evidence I gathered proves they're not just stealing wages, they're selling people. Hundreds of people, families torn apart and shipped to work camps across the territory. I've been working with others, people who escaped, trying to build a network to help families find each other and get to safety. There's a man named Crawford, the old mine foreman, who's been helping coordinate rescues. If something happens to me, find Crawford in the hidden valley past Eagle Rock. He'll know how to use the evidence to stop this evil. Take care of yourself, my brave girl. Remember that Mama loves you more than all the stars in the sky. Your devoted mother." Tank read the letter twice, his mind reeling with the implications. Sarah wasn't a victim. She was leading a resistance movement. The railroad construction camp wasn't the heart of the operation. It was just one, spoke in a wheel of systematic human trafficking that stretched across the entire territory. "The map," he said suddenly, understanding flooding through him. She wasn't mapping Vale's operation to expose it. She was mapping it to fight it. Morton was keeping watch at the window. "Those riders are still coming. 3 men, armed, taking their time like they own the place." Tank folded Sarah's letter carefully and handed it back to Pip. "Your ma's alive, little one. But she's not where we thought, and this situation is a lot more dangerous than I imagined. What do we do?" Tank looked at his weapons, then at the map showing the vast scope of the trafficking network, then at Pip's determined face. Everything he'd believed about this situation had just changed. Sarah wasn't a kidnapped victim waiting for rescue. She was a freedom fighter hiding in the wilderness, coordinating efforts to dismantle a criminal empire. "We find Crawford," Tank decided, "and we join your ma's war." The sound of boots on his porch steps ended the conversation. Tank moved to the door, his hand resting on his gun butt, while Morton positioned himself to cover the back entrance. "Caldwell!" The voice from outside was harsh, commanding. "We know you're in there. Come out and we'll make this easy." Tank opened the door slowly, letting his presence fill the doorframe. 3 men stood in his yard, all wearing the expensive clothes and confident bearing of professional killers. The man in front was tall and lean, with the kind of pale eyes that suggested violence came naturally to him. "You'd be the fellows who've been asking about me," Tank said conversationally. "Name's Hartwell. I work for Mr. Vale." The man's smile was cold and practiced. "Seems you've been causing problems for legitimate business operations. Mr. Vale thought we should have a conversation about your future plans." Tank stepped onto his porch, noting how the other 2 men had positioned themselves to cover potential escape routes. Professional work, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed he was the same peaceful carpenter who'd been living quietly in Dry Creek for 15 years. "Tell you what," Tank said, his voice carrying the deadly calm that had once made grown men reconsider their life choices. "Why don't you ride back to Vale and tell him that Tank Caldwell declares war on his whole operation? Tell him I know about the trafficking, the work camps, the missing families. Tell him—" Hartwell's hand moved toward his gun, but Tank's Colt was already clearing leather with the fluid speed that had made him legendary. The shot echoed across the desert like thunder, and Hartwell pitched backward into the dust with a hole through his chest. The other 2 men were fast, but Tank was faster. The second man managed to draw before Tank's next shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. The third man threw his hands up, sudden wisdom overcoming whatever courage Vale's money had bought. "Jesus," the survivor whispered. "You really are Tank Caldwell?" Tank kept his gun trained on the man, while Morton emerged to collect weapons. "Ride back to your boss," Tank said quietly. "Tell him the old Tank Caldwell is back, and he's coming for every soul you've stolen." As the wounded men fled toward town, Tank realized there was no going back now. The quiet carpenter was dead, and in his place stood the man who'd once been the most dangerous gun in 3 territories. The war for Sarah Caldwell's freedom and the freedom of hundreds of others had officially begun. The gunshots had awakened half of Dry Creek, and within an hour, Tank's cabin was surrounded by townspeople, drawn by curiosity and concern. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire, carrying with it whispers of the old Tank Caldwell's return and speculation about what it meant for their quiet community. Sheriff Morton helped Tank load supplies, while Pip gathered her few possessions, including the precious doll that had hidden her mother's letter. The sight of Tank strapping on his gun belt sent ripples of recognition through the gathered crowd, some fearful, others oddly proud that their peaceful carpenter had revealed himself to be a legend. "Tank," Patricia called from the edge of the crowd. "Whatever you're planning, you don't have to do it alone." Tank paused in securing his saddlebags to look at the faces surrounding his cabin. Doc Henderson stood beside his medical bag, ready to treat wounds. Patricia gripped a shotgun with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. Even old Miguel from the livery stable held a rifle, his weathered hands steady despite his age. "This isn't your fight," Tank said quietly. Like hell it isn't, Patricia replied. You think we don't know what goes on in those mining camps? You think we don't have friends and family who've disappeared into Vale's operations? She gestured toward the crowd. Half the people here came to Dry Creek running from something. Time we stopped running and started fighting back. Morton stepped forward, his sheriff's badge glinting in the morning sun. Tank, what you're talking about, rescuing those workers. Taking down a trafficking network, that's bigger than one man can handle, even if that man is you. Tank felt the weight of their expectation, the burden of leadership he'd never wanted but seemed destined to carry. He looked at Pip, who watched him with absolute faith in her young eyes. Then at the map showing the scope of the criminal empire they were challenging. This won't be like arresting a drunk cowboy or breaking up a saloon fight, he warned. Vale's got professional killers working for him, men who won't hesitate to shoot anyone who gets in their way. Some of you might not come home. Some of us might not have homes to come back to if we don't stop this, Doc Henderson said firmly. My grandson went missing from a lumber camp last year. Told us he was heading to California, but I always wondered. The old man's jaw set in a hard line. If there's a chance he's in one of those work camps, I'm going. Tank studied the determined faces around him. These weren't gunfighters or soldiers. They were shopkeepers, farmers, craftsmen who'd chosen courage over comfort. The kind of people worth fighting for and with. All right, Tank decided. But we do this smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We get in, we get the workers out, and we get the evidence to someone who can act on it. The next few hours passed in careful preparation. Tank studied Sarah's map with Morton and the other men, identifying the most likely location for the main work camp based on the network of supply routes. Patricia organized food and medical supplies, while the women of Dry Creek prepared for what might become a flood of rescued workers needing care. Tank found himself standing in front of his cabin's mirror, adjusting his gun belt with hands that remembered the weight and balance from 15 years ago. The man looking back at him was older, grayer, but the eyes held the same cold determination that had once made him feared across 3 territories. You look like the man in the stories, Pip said from behind him. Tank turned to find her watching from the doorway, clutching her rag doll with its hidden secrets. Those stories true, Tank? About all the men you killed? Tank knelt to her level, choosing his words carefully. Some of them. I did things I'm not proud of, Pip. Hurt people who maybe didn't deserve it. That's why I came here, why I tried to live peaceful. But sometimes you gotta fight for what's right. Sometimes, Tank agreed. But fighting changes a man, makes him harder, colder. I don't want that to happen to you. Pip's small hand touched his cheek with surprising gentleness. Ma always said the measure of a man isn't whether he fights, but what he fights for. You're fighting for her, for all those families. That makes you a good man, no matter what stories folks tell. Tank felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of guilt and self-doubt that had bound him for years. Maybe the child was right. Maybe redemption wasn't about avoiding violence entirely, but about choosing when violence served justice rather than pride or anger. As afternoon faded toward evening, the volunteer rescue party assembled in the street outside Tank's cabin. 12 men and women, armed with whatever weapons they could find, and united by determination to right a terrible wrong. Tank looked at their faces, some scared, all resolute, and felt the familiar weight of command settle on his shoulders. Listen careful, he told them. We ride hard to Eagle Rock, find this Crawford fellow, and get current intelligence on the camp locations. No one moves against the guards until we know exactly how many workers we're dealing with and what kind of resistance we'll face. Morton checked his rifle one final time. What if Crawford's been caught? What if it's a trap? Tank had considered the possibility. Sarah's letter was weeks old, and anything could have happened in the Apache caves where she'd been hiding. But Pip's faith that her mother was still alive had become his own, and he'd learned to trust the instincts that had kept him breathing through dozens of gunfights. Then we adapt, Tank said simply. But we don't turn back. As they mounted their horses and prepared to ride toward a confrontation that would either free hundreds of enslaved workers or end in their own deaths, Tank felt the old familiar calm settle over him. The peace that came before battle, when all the planning was done and only action remained. He looked back once at Dry Creek, at the small community that had given him 15 years of healing and hope. Then he turned his horse toward the mountains and the reckoning that waited in the hidden valleys beyond. Beside him, Pip sat straight in her saddle, her mother's locket gleaming at her throat, and her young face set with determination that reminded Tank powerfully of Sarah's stubborn courage. Whatever they found in those mountains, whether rescue or tragedy, they would face it together. The old Tank Caldwell rode toward his destiny, carrying with him not just guns and ammunition, but the hopes of a town that had chosen to stand against evil. Behind him, Dry Creek held its breath and waited to see if legends could still change the world. Time would tell if one man's return to violence could serve the cause of justice, or if some sins were too heavy for even righteous anger to lift. But as the rescue party disappeared into the desert dusk, Tank knew he was finally fighting for something that mattered more than his own redemption. He was fighting for family. The hidden valley past Eagle Rock revealed itself just as Sarah's map had promised, a natural bowl in the mountains concealed by towering red stone formations that blocked it from view until a rider was almost upon it. Tank's rescue party approached the rim just before dawn, the horses' hooves muffled by careful placement on the rocky trail that Crawford had marked as the safest route. From their vantage point, Tank could see the full scope of Vale's operation spread below them, like a vision from hell. 3 separate compounds dotted the valley floor, connected by well-worn paths and surrounded by guard towers that rose from the desert like skeletal fingers. Smoke from cooking fires and forges created a haze that hung over everything, while the sound of hammers and saws echoed off the canyon walls in a rhythm that spoke of forced labor and human misery. "Sweet Jesus," Morton whispered, lowering his field glasses. "That's not a work camp. That's a prison." Tank studied the layout with the tactical eye he'd developed during his gunfighting years. The compounds were well designed for defense, with clear fields of fire between buildings and guard posts positioned to cover all approaches. But the designers had been thinking about keeping people in, not keeping attackers out, a distinction that might prove crucial in the hours ahead. Crawford found them just as the sun began to paint the eastern peaks with gold. The former mine foreman emerged from a concealed cave entrance, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to survive in hostile territory. He was older than Tank had expected, maybe 60, with grey hair and the lean build of someone who'd been living rough for months. "You'd be Caldwell," Crawford said without preamble. "Sarah said you might come looking eventually. She alive? Last I saw her 3 days ago. But she's not here." Crawford gestured toward the valley. "She's down there in the central compound. Walked right into Vale's hands 2 weeks back." Tank felt ice form in his chest. "Walked in, why?" "Because that's where they're holding the children." Crawford's voice carried a weariness that spoke of too many hard choices. "Vale's been separating families, using the young ones as leverage to keep the adults working." Sarah couldn't stand it anymore. "Said she was going to get those kids out or die trying." Pip pressed close to Tank's side, her face pale but determined. "Ma's really down there?" Crawford studied the girl with kind eyes. "She is, little one, and she talks about you every chance she gets. Proudest mama I ever saw." His expression hardened. "But Vale's got her in the punishment block now. Heard he's planning to make an example of her, show the other workers what happens to troublemakers." Tank's hand found the butt of his Colt, old habits surfacing like muscle memory. "How many guards?" 24 in the valley working in shifts. 8 on duty at any time, 4 more sleeping in the barracks, 12 off duty in the town compound up the ridge." Crawford pointed to positions on the valley floor. "Problem is, they've got that bell tower in the center. One ring and every guard in the valley comes running." Morton studied the layout through his glasses. "Tank, this is suicide. Even if we take out the guards silently, we've got maybe 200 workers to evacuate through mountain passes that Vale's people know better than we do." Tank was quiet for a long moment, weighing options and calculating odds with the cold precision that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. The smart play was to retreat, find federal authorities, and organize a proper military response. But Sarah was in the punishment block, scheduled for execution as an example to others. And the children Crawford had mentioned were probably suffering in ways that didn't bear thinking about. Crawford, how many of the workers would fight if given the chance? Most of them. They've been beaten down, but they're not broken, especially if they thought their families might get free. Crawford's eyes gleamed with something that might have been hope. Got maybe 30 men who've been planning something, waiting for the right moment. Tank made his decision with the swift certainty that had always served him in moments of crisis. Here's what we're going to do. Morton, take half our people and circle around to the north entrance. Wait for my signal, then hit the guard barracks hard and fast. Patricia, you and Doc get to that cave system Crawford mentioned and set up a medical station for wounded. What about the bell tower? Morton asked. Tank smiled grimly. Leave that to me and Pip. Tank, no. Morton's voice was sharp with concern. You can't take a child into that. I'm not taking her into anything, Tank replied. She's going because that's her mother down there. And because sometimes the smallest person can go places the rest of us can't. He looked at Pip, seeing Sarah's stubborn courage reflected in the girl's young face. But only if you're sure, little one. This isn't a game, and I can't promise we'll both come out alive. Pip's hand found her mother's locket, drawing strength from the connection it represented. Ma needs us, Tank, I'm sure. Crawford had been listening with growing amazement. You're actually going to try this? Not try, Tank corrected, checking his weapons with methodical precision. We're going to succeed. Those people down there have suffered enough, and Veil's operation ends today. As the rescue party split up to take their positions, Tank found himself alone with Pip on the ridge overlooking the valley. The guard tower that housed the warning bell stood like a monument to oppression in the center of the main compound, its wooden structure rising 30 feet above the surrounding buildings. Remember what I taught you about moving quiet, Tank told Pip as they prepared to descend into the valley. Stay low. Watch where you step and don't make any noise until I deal with the guards. What if something goes wrong? Tank knelt and placed his hands on her small shoulders. Then you run. Don't look back. Don't try to help me. Just run to Crawford's cave and let the others get you to safety. Promise me. Pip nodded solemnly. I promise. But Tank, yeah? Nothing's going wrong. Ma's counting on us. As they began their descent into the valley, where Sarah Caldwell waited in chains and hundreds of enslaved workers prayed for deliverance, Tank felt the old familiar calm settle over him, the peace that came before battle, when planning ended and action began. The bell tower loomed ahead, its wooden frames stark against the morning sky. Somewhere in the compound beyond, Sarah was probably watching the sunrise and wondering if she'd live to see it set. Tank intended to make sure she did. The final battle for the soul of the territory was about to begin, and Tank Caldwell was ready to become the legend one more time, not for glory or reputation, but for the simple, powerful need to bring a mother home to her daughter. In the distance, a guard's voice called out the change of shift, and Tank's hand settled on his gun butt with the certainty of a man who'd finally found his true purpose. Time to ring some bells of his own. Tank and Pip moved through the pre-dawn shadows like ghosts, using every scrap of cover the valley floor provided. The guard rotation had just changed, leaving the sentries tired and inattentive, exactly what Tank had counted on when timing their approach. His boots made no sound on the packed earth, and Pip followed his movements with the natural stealth of a child who'd learned to stay hidden. The bell tower stood 50 yards ahead, its wooden platform accessible only by a ladder that would leave them exposed for precious seconds. Tank counted 2 guards visible in the immediate area, one walking a lazy patrol between buildings, another sitting in a chair beside the tower's base. Apparently dozing in the cool morning air, Tank drew his knife instead of his gun, the blade sliding from its sheath without the whisper of sound that might betray their presence. He touched Pip's shoulder and pointed toward a stack of lumber 20 feet from the tower, then held up 5 fingers. She nodded understanding. Wait 5 minutes, then move to that position. The sleeping guard never woke up. Tank's arm circled his throat from behind, applying pressure to the carotid artery with the precise technique that rendered men unconscious without killing them. The guard went limp in Tank's grasp, and Tank lowered him gently to the ground before binding his hands and gagging him with strips torn from the man's own shirt. The patrolling guard proved more challenging. Tank had to wait for him to turn away from the tower, then cross 15 feet of open ground in perfect silence. The man started to turn at the last second, possibly sensing movement, but Tank's knife hilt caught him behind the ear with surgical precision. Another unconscious guard, another few minutes of safety. Pip emerged from her hiding place like a shadow, her small face determined despite the danger surrounding them. Tank gestured toward the ladder, and she began climbing with the agility of youth while he kept watch below. The bell itself was massive, cast iron that would produce a sound audible for miles in the mountain air. Working with practiced efficiency, Tank and Pip wrapped the bell's clapper in thick cloth taken from the guard's gear, then secured it with rope to prevent any accidental noise. The job took 3 precious minutes, but when finished, the bell was effectively silenced. Now what? Pip whispered. Tank pointed toward a low building on the compound's eastern edge. Crawford said, "That's the punishment block. Your ma's in there?" He checked his pocket watch. 5 minutes until Morton's group was supposed to attack the guard barracks. "When the shooting starts, you stay up here and keep watch. Anyone tries to ring this bell, you cut those ropes, understand?" Pip drew a small knife Tank had given her for emergencies. "Understand." Tank dropped from the tower platform and moved toward the punishment block with deadly purpose. The building was small, windowless, designed to break spirits rather than house criminals with any hope of comfort. A single guard sat outside the door, reading a newspaper by lamplight. The guard looked up as Tank approached, probably expecting to see one of his colleagues. Instead, he found himself staring into the coldest eyes he'd ever seen, a split second before Tank's fist rendered him unconscious. Tank caught the falling man and lowered him quietly, then tried the door, locked, but the hinges were on the outside, a design flaw that proved fatal to security. Tank's knife blade worked between the metal pins, loosening them enough that a firm push sent the door swinging inward. The interior was darker than midnight, but Tank's eyes adjusted quickly to reveal a single cell containing 3 figures huddled against the far wall. One of them looked up at his entrance, and Tank's breath caught in his throat. Sarah Caldwell was thinner than her photograph suggested, her dark hair streaked with premature grey and her clothes torn from rough treatment. But her eyes, Pip's eyes, blazed with unbroken spirit despite weeks of captivity. When she saw Tank, those eyes widened with recognition and desperate hope. "You're him," she whispered. "The man Pip told me about. Tank Caldwell. I'm here for you and your daughter," Tank said simply, breaking the chains that bound her with a pair of bolt cutters he'd brought for the purpose. "Can you walk?" "I can run, if I have to." Sarah struggled to her feet, then turned toward her fellow prisoners, an elderly man and a woman barely out of her teens. "But I won't leave without them." Tank freed the other prisoners quickly, noting that both bore the marks of systematic abuse. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, her spirit nearly broken by whatever horrors she'd endured. The old man was weak but determined, his eyes fierce with the desire for vengeance. "How many children in the main compound?" Tank asked as they prepared to leave. 14, Sarah replied. "Ages 6 to 15. They're kept in the building next to the foreman's quarters." Tank's jaw tightened. Rescuing 4 people was one thing. Evacuating 14 children under fire was another challenge entirely. But looking at Sarah's face, seeing the maternal desperation there, he knew there was no choice. Gunfire erupted from the northern end of the compound as Morton's team hit the guard barracks right on schedule. Shouts of alarm echoed off the canyon walls, and Tank could see muzzle flashes lighting up the pre-dawn darkness. The rescue had officially begun. "This way," Tank said, leading the freed prisoners toward the main compound where the children were held. "Stay low, move fast, and if shooting starts around us, hit the ground and stay down." They'd covered half the distance when a guard rounded the corner of a storage building, rifle in hand and clearly heading for his post. Tank's Colt cleared leather with practiced speed, the shot echoing through the valley like thunder. The guard spun and fell, but not before his own rifle discharged into the air. More shouts erupted from throughout the compound. Guards poured from buildings like angry hornets, some running toward Morton's gunfire, others spreading out to search for additional threats. Tank counted at least 8 men converging on their position. "Sarah, get the others to those rocks and keep them down," Tank ordered, pointing toward a tumble of boulders that would provide cover. "I'll hold them off." "Tank, there are too many." Tank was already moving, his Colt speaking with deadly accuracy as he engaged the approaching guards. His first shot dropped a man trying to flank them from the left. His second sent another guard diving for cover behind a wagon. Years of careful peace fell away like a discarded coat, revealing the gunfighter who'd once been the terror of 3 territories. But even Tank Caldwell couldn't fight 8 men at once and protect 4 prisoners. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, rifle fire erupted from the bell tower above them. Pip had abandoned her watchpost to provide covering fire with a rifle she'd taken from one of the unconscious guards. The girl's shots weren't particularly accurate, but they didn't need to be. The unexpected attack from above scattered the guards and bought Tank precious seconds to reach better cover. Working together, father and daughter, for that's what they'd become, held off superior numbers while Sarah and the other prisoners made their way toward the children's quarters. In the distance, Tank could see Morton's group had successfully taken the guard barracks and were now moving to secure the worker compounds. But the hardest part of the rescue was just beginning. Somewhere in the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Sarah disappeared into the building where 14 frightened children waited for salvation. Tank could only pray that his reputation was enough to keep Vale's remaining men at bay, long enough for a mother to save not just her own daughter, but everyone's children. The battle for the valley's soul raged on, with everything depending on the courage of ordinary people who'd chosen to stand against evil. The sun had climbed high above the canyon walls by the time the last of Vale's guards threw down their weapons in surrender. Tank stood in the compound's central courtyard, his Colt still smoking from the final confrontation, watching as Morton and the other rescuers herded prisoners toward the caves where they could be held until federal marshals arrived. The cost had been steep, but not as terrible as Tank had feared. 2 of their rescue party had taken wounds, nothing Doc Henderson couldn't handle, while Vale's operation had lost 6 men killed and 12 captured. More importantly, they'd freed over 200 workers from 3 compounds, including the 14 children whose liberation had driven Sarah back into captivity. Tank found Sarah sitting on the steps of the children's building, surrounded by youngsters who clung to her like she was salvation itself. Her face was streaked with tears and dust, but her eyes blazed with the fierce joy of a mother reunited with not just her own child, but with all the children she'd risked everything to save. Pip ran across the courtyard and threw herself into her mother's arms with such force that both of them nearly toppled backward. Tank watched the reunion from a respectful distance, feeling something in his chest loosen and settle. Not peace exactly, but the deep satisfaction of a job completed and a promise kept. "Ma," Pip sobbed against Sarah's shoulder. "I knew you weren't dead. I knew you'd come back. I never left, baby girl." "Not really." Sarah's voice was thick with emotion as she stroked her daughter's hair. "Even when they locked me up, even when things looked darkest, I carried you right here in my heart." Sarah looked up and caught Tank's eye across the courtyard. Without releasing Pip, she reached into her dress and withdrew something that caught the morning sunlight, a simple gold ring worn thin by years of honest work. "This was my mother's," Sarah said as Tank approached. "And her mother's before that. Been in our family for 3 generations. She held the ring out to him with hands that trembled slightly. "I want you to have it." Tank stared at the offered ring, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering. "Sarah, I can't take something that important to your family. You are family now," Sarah said firmly. "You brought my daughter back to me, and you brought me back to her. More than that, you gave all these people their freedom." She gestured toward the workers, who were gathering their few possessions and preparing for the journey home. "Some debts can't be repaid with money, Tank. They can only be honored with trust." Tank accepted the ring with hands that had killed 6 men that morning, but somehow felt cleaner than they had in years. He slipped it onto his little finger, where it rested like a benediction against skin that had forgotten what absolution felt like. "What happens now?" Pip asked, looking between her mother and Tank with eyes that had seen too much violence for someone so young. "Now we go home," Sarah replied. "All of us, together." Crawford emerged from the main compound, carrying a leather satchel stuffed with documents. "Found Vale's records," he announced. "Everything. Financial statements, correspondence with territorial officials, shipping manifests for human cargo. Enough evidence to hang half the territorial government and shut down operations in 4 other counties." Tank nodded grimly. Vale himself had escaped during the fighting, disappearing into the mountain passes like the snake he was. But his empire was broken, his workers freed, and his crimes documented beyond any hope of cover-up. "Morton's already sent riders to fetch federal marshals," Tank said. "This evidence reaches the right people. It'll be the end of organized trafficking in this territory." The journey back to Dry Creek took 3 days, slowed by the needs of children and elderly workers who'd been pushed beyond their limits by months of forced labor. Tank rode at the head of the column with Sarah and Pip, marveling at how natural it felt to have them beside him after so many years of solitude. Sarah proved to be exactly the kind of woman he'd expected from Pip's stories. Strong, intelligent, fiercely protective of those she loved, but possessed of the gentle compassion that made children gravitate toward her like flowers turning toward sunlight. Watching her interact with the rescued families, Tank began to understand why she'd been willing to risk everything to save people she barely knew. On the second night, as they camped in a sheltered valley with sentries posted against the possibility of pursuit, Sarah found Tank sitting alone by the dying fire, staring into flames that reminded him uncomfortably of muzzle flashes. "Having second thoughts?" she asked, settling beside him with the easy familiarity of someone who'd shared danger and survived. "About what?" "About going back to being Tank the carpenter instead of Tank the gunfighter. About whether you can put the violence back in its box now that you've let it out." Tank was quiet for a long moment, considering the question he'd been asking himself since the first shots were fired. "I killed 6 men today, Sarah. Shot them down without hesitation or regret because they stood between me and getting you back to Pip. That should bother me more than it does. Should it? They were slavers, Tank, dealers in human misery who would have killed any of us without blinking." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "The man who rescued my daughter, who freed 200 people from bondage. That's not the same man who used to hire his gun to the highest bidder. That's someone who chose to use violence in service of justice. And if I can't tell the difference anymore, if the line between justice and vengeance gets blurred..." Sarah smiled and pointed toward the camp, where Pip was helping Doc Henderson tend to wounded children. "Then that little girl will remind you. She's got her grandmother's gift for seeing the good in people, even when they can't see it themselves." 3 months later, Tank stood in the doorway of his expanded cabin, watching Pip teach a group of Dry Creek children the rope work he'd shown her. Sarah worked beside Patricia in the saloon's kitchen, preparing food for the harvest celebration that had become an annual tradition since the rescue. The cabin was different now, larger, brighter, filled with the sounds of family life that Tank had never expected to know. Sarah had moved in after a courtship that was formal in public and passionate in private, bringing with her not just Pip, but a dozen other rescued children who'd had nowhere else to go. Tank's carpentry business had expanded to include furniture making, and his reputation as a craftsman had spread far enough that orders came from 3 counties. But more importantly, his reputation as a man who stood against injustice had made Dry Creek a destination for people seeking fresh starts and honest opportunities. The ring Sarah had given him caught the afternoon light as Tank adjusted a loose board on the porch railing. He wore it always now, a reminder of the day he'd learned that some violence was holy, some fights were worth the cost, and some families were chosen rather than born. In the distance, Pip's laughter rose above the other children's voices as she demonstrated a particularly complex knot. The sound filled Tank with a contentment he'd never imagined possible, the peace that came not from avoiding conflict, but from knowing he'd fought for the right reasons. As Sarah emerged from the saloon and walked toward him with flour on her hands and love in her eyes, Tank realized he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all those years in the desert. Not redemption through solitude, but redemption through connection. Not peace through isolation, but peace through family. The old Tank Caldwell had died in that mountain valley, shot down along with Vale's guards. In his place stood a man who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love was the willingness to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And in the end, that understanding had brought him home.